Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer, for being here. I'm really pleased to have you on. I'm very, very interested in the subject of your book, Liminal Dreaming, and since we are right now in this quarantine and this uh, strange times, as we were saying. Um, Maybe you could tell me a little bit about yourself, and maybe we could we could flow from that into seeing how liminal dreaming can be used in these times to help people.
Great. So my name is Jennifer Dumpert, and I'm gonna just since I have it here, I always have when I'm doing interviews, so I can remind myself of what's happening in
It's a
my own
very
mind.
awesome cover, by the way.
Yeah, I was lucky. As an author, you don't get much choice. The publisher tells you what it's going to be. So I've always been a really avid dreamer. A lot of my earliest memories from childhood are dreams. And I have been speaking and writing about different aspects of dreaming for a long time. The use of oneirogens, lucid dreaming, dream practices. And then 4 or 5 years ago, I started getting really interested in liminal dreaming. So liminal comes from the Latin word limen. It's like a threshold or a doorway. So it's a place that's neither here nor there, both here and there, like a doorway or, threshold, border. The liminal dream spaces are those spaces between waking and sleep. So hypnagogia when you're falling asleep, and hypnopompia as you're waking up, that are both waking and dreaming. You have access to both waking and dreaming at the same time. So I really started to get into these spaces as kind of my meditation. I have a long practice with meditation practices, with other sorts of practices, yoga practices, various ways of playing with consciousness. And so I got really interested in this liminal dreaming as a kind of a primary practice. So that's kind of a large net of who I am and what I'm doing.
Yeah, in fact, just now before our interview, in part because I was a little bit tired, but also as a kind of preparation, I took a small nap, and I had in mind the idea, and I wanted to see what would come up. And I generally don't remember very much my dreams, and when I'm trying to do the the, the going to sleep while staying quite conscious, it's kind of hard for me to keep awake. Let's say, to keep conscious of the transition. And I think uh, I was like, when I started going to sleep or falling asleep, I think I went like I connected with somebody or with something, and I think we were like smoking weed or something. I'm not sure. I don't know why that came up. I was like hoping to have something super awesome to tell you right now, but it was just like, I don't know, kind of random in a way.
Well, I mean, it kind of makes sense that you would have the experience of someone smoking weed, because it's a very psychedelic space. It's very much like experiences you might have if you're using some sort of substance to change your consciousness. Everybody is actually a natural liminal dreamer of the EEG states that we all go through in every 24-hour period. We all go through certainly hypnagogia, and it's most brainwave states are marked by a sine wave. So there's delta sleep, which is the lowest. It's like 0.5 to 3, and it's when your brain waves are going slow and low. And there's gamma, which is 40 waves per second or higher, really high, high up. And most of these EEG states that we all know are sort of marked by one sine wave that comes to the 4. Theta, which is where we spend most of our sleep and where meditators go, has 2, but liminal dream states, hypnagogia and hypnopompia, have 6. They're very chaotic, but you go through them. It's by far the shortest brainwave state you go through without training. Without training, most of us only spend minutes there, but everybody has the experience. When you're falling asleep and you have that hallucinatory kind of, maybe you hear strange sounds or see faces turning toward you, or have like a half dream, but you aren't quite asleep yet. Like you can hear what your neighbor or your partner is doing. And when your arm jerks or your leg jerks, you know that you're there. And when you're waking up and you're in that half sleep, half awake, very drifting, you think that you have formed an idea and you realize that actually it's a dream, hypnopompia. But everybody actually naturally goes through these states. It's just a matter of stopping to pay attention to them. So it's unlike something like lucid dreaming or a lot of other practices where you have to really learn how to do it. Here, it's just a matter of stopping to pay attention. And so you were saying like with people, but with smoking weed, people who have regular relationships to cannabis mostly don't remember the dreams they have during the night, but it actually really helps to find liminal dream space. Like after the arc of the high, when you're sort of coming down at the tail end, it's a really easy time to find liminal dream space. And sometimes it is kind of as much like a thought or an idea. When you learn to go into the space and open it up, stranger things happen.
Yes. In my case, I used for some time a technique that I learned to. I was testing this idea of manifesting reality, and there's this technique that requires you to while you're falling asleep to connect with a feeling, with the feeling of what you want to manifest, the feeling of it already being true. And so like trying to feel the emotion of as if you were living that life already, and that's used as you're falling asleep. And it was an interesting experience. I don't know if I manifested the reality like exactly as what I wanted, let's say, but I actually did feel, and I am seeing a kind of effect or ripple from having applied that technique back like around 4 or 5 months ago. Oh, did your thing cut out?
It did.
Oh, okay. Where did you, were you able to?
You were talking about manifesting reality, and you weren't sure if it manifested exactly.
Yeah. Just as a parenthesis, the video is kind of, and the audio is kind of going a little bit wonky.
Yeah, should we just try going to audio?
All right, let's do that. Yeah, I've been shutting my video as well as you were speaking.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
follow you, but yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's try that. Hopefully that will work better.
Yeah. No. So as I was saying, I tried this technique for manifestation, which asks you to, as you're falling asleep, feel the feeling of the reality you want to manifest as if it already exists, and feel as if you are already living it. And I can see nowadays the ripples of that, of having tried that technique. I don't know if it was like an exact version, let's say, of that, but definitely I feel like going into that space and like planting a seed in there appears to have given a kind of fruit in later on.
There's a a lot of practices in my book, very much about the idea of practice. And one of these practices is just a dream incubation practice. So very much like what you were talking about, the idea of dream incubation is very old. I mean, thousands of years ago, we have early, in Greek cultures or the Mediterranean, the classical Greek cultures and what have you, of people working with this idea of manifesting through the dream space. And I think that a lot of the ideas come, and a lot of this in liminal dream space, in the hypnagogic and hypnopompic spaces. And it is partly, I think, because they're liminal, right? Because they're between waking and sleep. And I think people sort of equate that with, and I do as well, with the between whatever is like the hard, fast reality of, consensus reality of our shared world, and what is the sort of the hazier kind of overlay of our own whatever understanding or energy or over top of that. I mean, as basic as there's if you're talking about walking around your neighborhood, there's both some sort of objective map that could be made that shows where all the buildings and the trees are and the sidewalks. I mean, the idea exists anyway, that there could be some objective map, but maps really are subjective. If you were describing how to get to the store, you would use different landmarks maybe than your partner would, going from the same house to the same store, or particular places in the city have meaning for me because something happened there for me. So the map becomes the reality of the city. Even the map becomes something that I have created. So I've even in that most basic way, I've kind of co-created. And I think about that idea as liminal mind, something that I talk about a bunch in the book, that I really, when I was spending so much time in liminal spaces and reading how different cultures have worked with these liminal dream spaces, because that's what a lot of the book is too. And, everything from Jung to the Sufis, to ancient Greek cultures, cults of Asclepius, etc. And reading about how people understand this. For a lot of people, it is the sort of it's the liminal space. It's in the liminal dream space that you can access those things that are, both and neither. And so, the idea of co-creating a reality, it makes sense that would be a thing that you would try from liminal dream space.
Yeah, it feels like it's somewhere between, or like in the spectrum between conscious and unconscious, maybe. And like,
yeah,
because it's a space in which you are conscious, but it's kind of hard to remember or hard to like put names to things. So it feels like a kind of gray area between them.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of times I talk about a continuity of consciousness. We tend to think of being awake or asleep or conscious or unconscious as on off. It's like a switch. But in fact, there's a real continuity of consciousness between those things. You can be 20% awake and 80% asleep, or 80% awake and 20% asleep, or half and half. And you are in these liminal dream spaces, just like you said, you're both conscious and unconscious at the same time. So you can really go in and start to explore those spaces. And sometimes it's just barely unconscious, and my conscious mind can see, what's happening in the depths of my own mind. In these liminal dream spaces, you're unconscious enough that the daytime ego starts to go to sleep. The ego that usually drives your day. Oh yeah, it's very goal oriented. I have to, go buy tomatoes, or I need to call my mother. Oh, how well did I do? I need to accomplish. I need to, whatever. And in the liminal dream spaces, that daytime ego tends to sort of go to rest. It is not so much in the forefront of experience, but you still have your observing mind. And so whatever is in your unconscious, whether it's patterns or different kinds of ideas, symbols, memories, visuals, sounds, whatever it is, but from your own unconscious arises, and you can observe it. So you're simultaneously awake and dreaming. You really are. It really is that gray area between the two.
And would you say we are exploring simply something personal? I mean, what you were just saying makes me think like also our identity, like it loosens up. So is it possible that we're accessing some kind of a shared realm, a kind of, I don't know if in an Akashic record or the astral, or maybe the astral is already when you're unconscious? What do you think?
Well, so I tend to not think much about belief myself. So whether or not I believe something for me is a less interesting question, but definitely a lot. But I am interested in how people understand and manifest it. And it's a very popular idea indeed, that it is a shared place. I mean, everything from, very modern ideas of, Bob Monroe, the Robert Monroe Institute, the Bob Monroe Institute, is the guy who coined the phrase out-of-body experience. And he thought that we go into these other realms when we're in hypnagogia, that in hypnagogia, we have access to that place. Or within Tibetan Buddhism, there's the idea of the bardo, the space you go between death and rebirth. And a lot of practices that are like lucid dream practices or the natural light, a lot of these Tibetan Buddhist practices also start with working with liminal dream spaces. So also the idea that there's actually a place between life and death, or there's the old idea, the old yogic idea of the time between kalpas, when you're when Vishnu's creating the world, and there's like lying on the cloud, and when you go into yoga nidra, you're accessing that place. So the place between carnations of everything, of the universe. So definitely there's a lot of cultural resonance with the idea that the liminal dream space, or the Sufis again thought it was a place you could go, that it is in fact some sort of shared realm. I mean, I think it's interesting to follow those practices and see what arises. Without, for me, like I said, I don't tend to get caught up in the belief. I'm much more interested in the experience.
Yeah, right. So talking about experiences, what do you say could be? We were talking before we started that it would be possible to apply some kind of a practice with the liminal state to this particular moment in time when we're experiencing some kind of a crazy period with the outbreak of the virus. Do you think there's some practice or guidance that you could share with us to integrate, let's say, liminal practices with perhaps with how we transition during this period?
For sure. So in a couple of ways, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, needless to say, given what's happening in the world. And there are a couple ways that I think that working with liminal dreaming can really be helpful. One of these is just learning to go into both, a relaxed state and an interior world. So a lot of people right now are dealing with a lot of anxiety, a lot of unknown. It's financially and health wise, and is the world radically changing right now? I mean, I think the answer is yes. And how is that going to look? So there's a lot of unknown and a lot of fear, and going into these practices is really relaxing. It's really calming. So for example, yoga nidra, Nidra, yoga nidra practices will get you into a liminal dream space. And it's very calming to the nervous system. It's also a way of going inward. So inside of our experience, inside of our own conscious, unconscious, we're having these dream experiences. And the liminal dream tends to be it's not narrative in the same way that REM dreams, that the dreams we have in the middle of the night are. It's not usually like a story as much, and there's not necessarily a you in the world, like a self and other. There's only like the unfolding moment of what's happening, right? There's only consciousness in a way. And so it's a deep experience of a kind of a selfless and yet simultaneously inner world. And I think that we've gotten we're so outward focused in our cultures. We're so about accomplishing and doing and speaking and performing, and everyone wants to have their brand and everyone wants to be seen. And the more that we have cultures of like whatever, TikTok or YouTube or whatever, and it's people are trying to perform. And I sometimes fear that what's getting lost is the richness of inner life. And now that things are so sort of chaotic out there in the world, developing practices where there's fascinating experiences to be had just by closing one's eyes and going into these inner realms and watching one's own mind unfurl is a wonderful way of dealing. So that's one way that I think it's really useful.
Yeah, I've tried yoga nidra actually, and it's super relaxing. And just as in remembering dreams, I've had a hard time remembering or keeping the experience fresh in my mind. Is there ways in which we can do that, or is that even important? Is it actually just the practice that's important in itself and not so much the bringing it back?
It depends on what you're doing and why you're doing it. One of the things that I tell people, who come to my classes or workshops or who write to me after they've read my book, is that why are you doing it? Like, you're having the experience anyway. We're all having the experience as we're drifting off to sleep. Everybody goes through hypnagogia. And one of the wonderful things about the teaching that I do is almost all I have to do is point out to people that this experience is already you already have it, and people will have it. I mean, people listening to this podcast, if they don't already know what I mean when I'm talking about, when I describe liminal dreaming, most of them will now have the experience. Because again, all you're doing is paying attention to what you already do. So if you're only doing it for the interesting experience, it's fine to just go into it and have the experience. If it starts to really engage you, or if you decide that you want to develop your skills, naturally you'll start to remember more of what happens inside that space. So, with all things, attention, whatever you pay attention to is whatever is going to be in your life, whether that's complaining or playing piano or loving your dog. It doesn't matter. Whatever you give your attention to is what will flourish in your life. You are what you practice being. And so, paying some attention will naturally make you remember. But you can also use these practices for a wide range of goals: creativity and problem solving and healing. And there's a lot of different ways that you can use liminal dreaming. Again, I describe all this in the book. And if you're going for some particular goal, then you do want to try to develop the ability to remember a little bit. And there are practices, pretty easy practices, that will help you remember. Things like taking naps during the day. You can get like a voice activated recorder as an app you can download on your phone, usually $3 or $5 or the equivalent in other countries. But there's a lot of apps for smartphones that are voice activated recorders. So it's not just a recorder that you turn on, but you turn it on and you set it to voice activated. And as soon as you start talking or making noise, it starts recording, right? And so you can nap during the day with a voice activated recorder near you, so that as you sort of surface it from the experience, you can start talking. You can keep pen and paper and start trying to draw or paint or sculpt with clay, whatever it is, whatever the experience is you were having. You can nap with somebody else and try to share what the experience was as you're waking. The more often you go into it, the more you'll begin to remember. And again, it's not like REM dreams that you have in the middle of the night, because you can, if you're naturally just going in hypnagogia before you fall asleep at night, you're probably going to forget it. But if you do it during the day, you can stop yourself before you fall asleep. And then it's a lot easier to remember what just happened.
Right, like coming back, having like a short nap and coming back rather than sleeping the whole night and trying to remember on the other day. Yeah, that would be quite hard, I guess.
Yeah, and some people like me are naturally have very rich hypnopompia, which is what happens when you're waking up. And for people like that, people who love to lie in bed in the morning and drift through that hazy half dream, half waking. Some people, who have circadian rhythms like mine, people who wake up very slowly, who are often pretty confused in the morning, who are often late, stay up late, like to wake up late. For those people, remembering hypnopompia is actually pretty easy, because hypnopompia is the space just between sleep and when you're waking up. So you're coming into your conscious mind. But people who have a different kind of circadian rhythm, the kind of people who are like jump right awake, as soon as they wake up, they get out of bed and they're ready to go. They're fresh. They're usually early risers, more early rising, early to sleep. For those people, they have a really hard time remembering hypnopompia. So naps with hypnagogia is really the way to go. And people like that often also have a difficult time remembering dreams at all, even remembering REM dreams. And for people like that, so for people who have relationships with like cannabis or even sleeping pills, or people who wake up, bright and bushy-tailed, we'd say ready to go. Those are people who often don't have much experience with dreams, because those things interrupt with REM dreams. And for those people, liminal dreaming is great, because you can go into nap space and play with hypnagogia and really learn to reclaim your dream life.
Yeah, now that you mentioned this, the hypnopompia, I'm thinking of, I generally, before I wake up, as I am waking up, I've always thought it was kind of becoming lucid within the dream. But now that you mention it, it might be hypnopompia that I'm like right before I wake up, I kind of come online in a way, and I am within a kind of dream, and I can like sometimes I can even like choose to stay there. It's like a part of me realizes, oh, this is a dream, and I can choose to stay there, or I generally choose to stay because it's interesting, but it's like I know that I could just like open my eyes and it's like I am already awake in a way, but if I keep my eyes closed, I can like the dream can persist in a way. Would you say that's hypnopompia?
Yes, for sure. And although often when we're, our again, EEG, so, that, which is how, brainwave states get measured. A lot of our mind states get measured that way as an objective measure. Obviously there's subjective measures too, but it's a good way to talk about it. So in terms of brainwave states, REM is the state in which you have the kind of nighttime dreams, what people usually mean when they talk about dreams. And often when you're waking up, you go from REM through hypnopompia into waking. Mm-hmm. And so in hypnopompia, it's right, you're like, I can stay here. I know that I'm in the dream space. As long as I keep my eyes closed, I'm going to be able to drift here. I can go in and out of the same dream space. And if you're somebody who has spent enough time in playing with hypnopompic space, and most people, and it sounds like you're like me, somebody who naturally has a very easy time staying there. Most people who naturally have an easy time staying there have played with it a lot because it's very interesting and lovely state. You can actually also drift back over into REM a little bit and into a little bit more like full-fledged dream. So it's a very interesting place to play with your mind, to explore the experience of the unconscious as you're lying there kind of drifting closer to awake or closer into the dream space, and maybe even going back all the way down to the dream space and then floating back up into hypnopompia. So it's definitely a space where you can play with that kind of consciousness. And you're right, it's very interesting. For me, it's often very lovely. It's a very drifting, peaceful space. It's also where some weird things happen, but but yes, I would say that you're probably experiencing hypnopompia in there.
Yeah, in my experience, those moments or those experiences, those dreams have been very, very symbolic, very much like I mean, what would you say the hypnopompia experience? Is it something like concise, like you're experiencing characters doing things, or how would you describe the hypnopompia?
I would say not so much. I mean, generally with liminal dream, the closer you are to the conscious end of the spectrum, the more the dreams start to be a little bit more narrative. Maybe there's a storyline, but there also tend to be kind of a whirl, like a whirlwind, like a spinning kind of kaleidoscopic role of your own memories and dreams and associations and symbols. I mean, one of the things that's so fascinating about dream space, you asked earlier, is it only our personal or is there something else? They're definitely, everybody dreams. It's the strangest thing that all humans have in common, right? Every human who has ever lived dreams. I mean, that's, it's an essential part of our makeup. And of course, it's it's a very strange thing to have in common. And so it's this totally common experience, and yet it's deeply personal and individual. And, but Jung certainly, and other people have said the same, thought that we could tap into kind of a collective unconscious, into kind of like symbols or ideas that are naturally shared by people outside of their own personal experience. So I think often what you're seeing in the hypnopompic space or experience, because it's not just visual, all of the senses come into play in liminal dream space in interesting ways. Sound, definitely, and also touch. For me, it's very, very tactile experience, liminal dream. I even have scent and taste in there sometimes. but no, it's normally more of this kind of free associative kaleidoscopic whirl of whatever is in your own personal unconscious, whatever symbols or sounds or whatever have meaning, or that your memory pulls up, or that is what you associate with whatever else is happening.
Right. And you mentioned a little bit before the potential for healing during these liminal states.
Yeah. So so there's a lot of ways to be working with healing in terms of liminal dreaming. In terms of like just the basic physical, I mean, if you think about what does your body do when you're sick, right? You sleep, right? Sleep is very healing. And so being able to have as a practice, going into liminal dream spaces, going into a space where your body is sleeping or close to sleeping, is physically very healing. It's also very healing emotionally and spiritually. So yoga nidra, for example, and yoga nidra will bring you into a liminal dream space. Now, that's something I think, and a lot of other people who teach yoga nidra would say the same thing, would say that you're going into a hypnagogic space. Now, there are other teachers of yoga nidra who would want to call it something else, who think that saying hypnagogia is maybe simplifying it. So just in respect to that opinion, I will point that out. But a lot will say the same that I'm saying, that you're going into a hypnagogic space. And a lot of the idea is that as you're letting go of all of these concerns and all of your sort of day-to-day and whatever fear and anxiety you have, that's very emotionally healing. And in terms of yoga nidra, there have been different schools of yoga nidra that have worked with, for example, people who have PTSD. So they're like the iRest school has a whole program of yoga nidra that is for working with PTSD. And Uma Dinsmore Tully, who is a yoga nidra teacher from the UK, does wonderful work, has worked with yoga nidra and women in childbirth. So basically, yoga nidra as a way of working with active pain. And IRA School also uses yoga nidra for pain management. So there's a lot of different ways that yoga nidra can be used as healing. Jung had the idea of active imagination, and that's a practice I describe in my book, and I'm currently doing workshops with a woman in Los Angeles, Sheila Darcy, who has a program that she calls Sketch Poetic, and we're doing workshops that are using Jungian active imagination, which is basically what you do is you go into the hypnagogic space, and then you come out of the space and you engage with whatever happened in that space creatively. So maybe you paint, or you sculpt, or you choreograph yourself with your phone, do some choreographic dance, or I like to bead shoes, whatever it is, and you engage with what is happening in the hypnagogic space, and you keep going in and out of the hypnagogic space and continuing to work on your creative project until it's done, and that might be hours or days or years. And Jung felt that simply creatively engaging with what happens in the hypnagogic space, where you can have your waking mind observe what's happening in your unconscious, is enough for mental healing. When he had his horrible breakup with Freud and went through a period in which he himself said he was delusional, he used this practice to heal himself. That's where the Red Book comes from. But in terms of psychological, emotional healing, even just this practice can be enough. So there's a lot of ways that you can work with it for healing. Right.
There's this phrase from Jung of making the unconscious conscious, or bringing light to the unconscious, and I think this is what you're referring to, right?
Exactly.
Mm. Yeah. So the idea of ideas, right, and where ideas come from, and our ability to connect with them and to manifest them in this in this plane, in this 3D reality. That's a pretty interesting um, role that we play as humans.
Yeah, very much so. The poet Dale Pendle um, used to talk about interdimensional smuggling, the idea of
Mm.
bringing things between realms, bringing something back from the dream world and sort of manifesting it in the waking world, or even bringing, like what happens in lucid dreaming, bringing things from the waking world into the dreaming world, where the symbol or the image can be the point of continuity among all of the different states that you go through, be those psychedelic spaces or dream spaces or fear spaces or normal waking spaces, whatever it is, letting the image or the symbol be the continuity.
In what way do you mean being the continuity?
So, for example, you might have people who have difficult dream spaces. I often tell them to and one of the ways that you can work with bad dreams, scary dreams, anxiety dreams, whatever, is by working with a scent, right? So have a scent that you practice with, when you're in your meditation. So let's say you're working with the scent of rose. In your meditation, you have the scent of rose, and then maybe you carry a vial of rose water with you. And when you're doing something that makes you happy, walking by the ocean, you can smell the rose scent. And then when you're sleeping, you can have the rose next to you. And so then the scent of rose is the thing that can carry across the same idea, the same sort of like happiness, trying to hold on to the happiness in different states. Or I have a lot of dreams of being inappropriately barefoot. It's one of the ways that anxiety manifests for me. I've been actually having them in this last week. And I mean, and sometimes it's that I'm in the frozen tundra and I'm barefoot, I'm like, or I'm in like climbing on sharp rocks and I'm barefoot. Or sometimes it's socially inappropriate. I was at a formal black tie event at the Icelandic consulate, barefoot in a dream. So whatever it is, I have these dreams of being inappropriately barefoot. So one of the ways that I work with those dreams is by, in waking life, to sometimes be inappropriately barefoot, to places where it's going to make me a little uncomfortable, or it's going to be weird that I'm not wearing shoes to do that. And so the idea of being inappropriately barefoot, I'm sort of carrying across these different states of being as a way of exploring my own anxiety.
Right. Yeah. So I understand now the idea with the example from the rose, and with this that you're saying about being barefoot, you would like act out the dream in the real world, in that case, in a way,
Yeah.
or use an element from the material world, like for example keeping the rose close to you so that the scent would like activate something nice within the dream.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really
I mean,
good.
and it's well known that scent and sound are great ways to work with dreams. When we're sleeping, most of our senses shut down, right? We have chemicals like acetylcholine and other chemicals that work to sort of shut us down when we're sleeping, so that we don't act out our dreams or whatever. So you can't really talk, you can't really, generally you're paralyzed, so you're not really feeling anything, you can't see, but you can hear and smell just as well when you're sleeping as you can when you're awake. They're the senses that have the continuity, because there's no reason really to shut those senses down. And so, of course, there's how your mind interprets sounds you hear, or sense you smell when you're dreaming is one thing, but you definitely do smell them and do hear them. So you can start to associate things with sound or scent. Look what I was just talking about with sound. You can also, with scent rather, with the rose, you can also do with a sound. You can have there be a sound that you work with through the day and that you have next to you when you're sleeping, or that you have set, an alarm set to play that sound at a certain point. And that can give you a sort of sense, it can give you a continuity, or it's a way that you can work with things in your dreams by working with them in your waking world, because those senses carry over.
Wow, yeah. And I was wondering, have you ever had the experience of bringing back an idea from perhaps a liminal state or from the dreaming state, and doing all this working creatively with that idea?
Absolutely. So one of the other things that liminal dream space is great for is problem solving and creativity. So independently of each other, Salvador Dali and Thomas Edison came up with the same exercise for working with hypnagogia. And what they would do is they would, Salvador Dali would hold a big brass Spanish key in one hand, and Thomas Edison held a ball in each hand. And both men, when they were feeling tired, would sit back in a very large, comfortable chair with metal plates on the ground, holding either the balls or the key, arms dangling, and then they would drift into a hypnagogic space. And Edison kept a notepad and a pencil next to him, and Dali kept a sketch pad. And as soon as they started to drift out of the hypnagogic state and to actually fall asleep, they would naturally let go of what they were holding, the key or the balls, and they would hit the metal plates and clatter and wake them up. And Dali would immediately start sketching, and Edison would just start writing down ideas. And a lot of what is, and so Edison came up with a lot of his inventions that way. And a lot of inventions were actually, or ideas were conceived in hypnagogic dream space. The periodic table was conceived in a hypnagogic dream.
Oh, really?
The benzene ring was understood in a hypnagogic dream. Agassi figured out how to chip away stone to find fossils in a hypnagogic dream. A lot of what happens is that there's something that, and again, for if you're trying to problem solve, if you have an idea or you have thoughts, a lot of times our own minds get in the way. So if you start to think a different way, if you're using these practices to kind of think a different way, then a lot of times your mind will come up with things or will understand things, make different kinds of connections than your waking mind does. So I have, I'm a public speaker. I give a lot of talks and workshops. And there's a part of a talk that I give where I'm talking about some of the steps along the continuity of consciousness between waking and sleep. I've kind of identified four different stages of hypnagogia that I go through as I'm falling asleep, each one subsequently deeper than the last. And then I give this part of my talk, which is probably of an hour-long talk. I probably spend 15 or 20 minutes, talking about this continuity of consciousness and explaining the stages of hypnagogia. And then when I'm finished, I tell people that part of the talk I just gave you, I wrote in a hypnagogic dream, which is true. I conceived, it was in a hypnagogic dream that I understood that there were different levels of the experience. And then it was in hypnagogic dream that I explored those different levels of experience and how I could go, what practices could make me go to each subsequent stage of hypnagogia. And then I would wake and write it down and then go back in, over the space of, months. I used the hypnagogic practice to write the part of the talk that I normally give about hypnagogia. It's very meta. So absolutely. I can give you a lot of other examples as well, but I use it myself a lot.
Right, and this makes me think a bit of this idea between the ancient people of certain gods bringing information. So maybe people were like connecting to whatever it is that we connect when we reach for ideas, and they were appearing in certain shape, in certain aspects, and people would perhaps give name to that, and then say, oh, the god whatever gave me this idea, and suddenly they had agriculture or writing and stuff like that, maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of going to the dream space for ideas, for wisdom, to help, to help figure out problems, for personal reasons. I mean, among indigenous cultures, that's not at all an unusual concept. I mean, the Hausa people of South Africa use Selene capensis, which is a root that they dry and froth and eat, to go to the dream realm where the ancestors are, and the ancestors can give you wisdom or give you teachings. Or the Chantal people of southern Mexico or northern Guatemala work with an herb called Calia zacatachichi, again to help them go to the realms where the gods or the spirits live, and there in the dream space they can get this wisdom and this understanding. I had this amazing experience when I saw the Hollywood blockbuster movie Black Panther, because in the movie they're in their African continent, their African country, where the leader goes into these spaces to meet with his ancestors. But in fact, when I learned when I was like reading the credits at the end, that some of what they're using for language, for like Wakanda, I believe is the name of the nation, was Hausa, was the language that they're using, the Hausa, like the Hausa people. And the Hausa people use Selene capensis to go in dream space to speak with their ancestors. And of course, in the Black Panther movie, that's what he does. He uses this glowing plant to go and speak to his ancestors. I'm like, oh wow, they're totally going into the Hausa idea of using Selene capensis to contact ancestors in a dream realm for wisdom. I loved seeing that popular culture moment of this deep idea that I write about.
Yes, it even brings to mind the possibility of this liminal realm. You know how there's this idea of well, for example, you mentioned earlier the bardo, right? So perhaps there's this possibility of the souls of the departed, in a way, of inhabiting a space, and this space not being, of course, our material realm, nor the unconscious entirely, but this liminal state that you're bringing up could fit as a place where all these people or all these entities could be inhabiting, perhaps.
It's right. I mean, and again, that's part of the idea of the bardo, and a lot of a lot of practices, of Tibetan Buddhist practices, but also modern practices. The artist Alex Gray has often talked about psychedelics as practice for the bardo. The idea of the liminal dreams as the space between not only waking and sleeping, conscious and unconscious, but also between death and rebirth. Quite fascinatingly, people who are dying, if they're dying naturally, are often in hypnagogia. I sat by the deathbed of my very beloved aunt, and I read about this in the book when she was dying. And after she had passed out of waking consciousness, which she never regained again, she spent some space of time in what I recognized was a hypnagogic space. And I have some practice speaking to people who are in hypnagogia, and it's often a non-linear conversation. If you speak to somebody who's in a hypnagogic space, a lot of times they'll answer you, but it might not. It's not like a waking conversation. So, so I would say, "Oh, Robin, where are you?" And she would be, "I'm at the movie theater with Ziggy Stardust, and we're clothing shopping," or my neighbors with their dogs that have human faces but don't like humans, or whatever. But I realized that she was in a hypnagogic space, and later I learned that quite coincidentally she was dying in a hospice run by this fellow named Christopher Kerr, a doctor who writes and speaks about the fact that dying people are often in hypnagogia. So the space between life and death often, not for everybody, obviously, but for a lot of people who are dying naturally, it involves, as opposed to being hit by a car or whatever, involves passing through a hypnagogic space. So in the idea of practice for the bardo, you can also think of going into liminal dream space as practice for dying, which is a thing that we are all going to do. It may well be very scary and intense, and going into liminal dream space, like practicing, learning, gaining a facility with the ability to maneuver in liminal dream space may well, in fact, be practice for the final thing that you will do, which is die.
Yeah, and that alone makes this idea extremely important, because there's so much anxiety around dying, around returning to the source. So yeah, very, very interesting. All the things that you have been speaking, they are like very mind-opening, because all these states, liminal states, we go through them, as you were saying, every day. So becoming like more acquainted with them is really, really important at least in the sense of learning more about who we are and what our capabilities are, right?
That's nicely said. Absolutely.
I think so, yeah. Well, Jennifer, this has been an extremely enlightening conversation. Very wonderful to meet you. Could you please let the audience know where they can find you, where they can find your book?
Absolutely. So the book is called Liminal Dreaming, Exploring Consciousness at the Edges of Sleep. It's distributed by Penguin, so you can find it anywhere. You can buy it on Amazon. You can support your local bookstore and go and ask them for it. And if they don't have it there, they can easily order it for you. I'm a big fan of supporting your local bookstore. You can also go to liminaldreaming.com. Liminal is Liminal, liminaldreaming.com. And I post a dream every day on Twitter. I've been doing that for 11 years as at Oneirifer, Oneirofer. Oneiro is Greek for dream. And then you can also find me on Facebook, Liminal Dreaming.
Yeah, very, very nice, everything that you're doing. Have you actually translated your book already into other languages?
It's being translated into Italian and maybe German. I'm really hoping for Spanish, because I've had a lot of I used to run a participatory dream group I mean, I still do it every once in a while, but I did it every month for years. And I had a lot of people participating from South and Central America. So I know that there's really a lot of awareness of dreaming and of becoming familiar with all the different mind states. So I'm hoping that happens as well.
Yeah, right. And I can imagine ancient cultures from Latin America, like Mayans and those kind of peoples, most likely were exploring the liminal states.
Most likely. I agree with you.
Yeah. Well, okay, Jennifer, this was lovely. Let's do it again some other time.
I agree. Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Sure, of course. I enjoyed it very much also. So, well, I'll be seeing you soon. Okay.
Okay.
And we can stay in touch.
Yep. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.